let's continue with our post-SONA reflections this afternoon with Zaakirah Vadi, who is a director at Defend Our Democracy. Zaakirah, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on. And I wonder just if you want to give us some broad strokes. There's obviously a lot of build-up to the president's speech last night. It's the first under the Government of National Unity. It's also a speech that would have had buy-in, or at least there would have been contributions to his GNU, from his GNU partners to the speech as well. But overall, what was your sense of the speech last night?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. Firstly, it's commendable that the president set out the kind of democracy that South Africa has established itself as. The kind of sovereign boundaries, the notion of non-racialism, and the shared common values of equality, of a shared common humanity. I think it's very important in the current geopolitical space and right-wing shifts that are taking place globally, that was set out at the outset of the speech. From Defend Our Democracy side, we have a specific interest in issues related to tackling state capture and corruption. The president highlighted some developments that have been taking place in relation to tackling the issue. But from our side, it certainly doesn't meet the scale of the problem and as new corruption cases are coming up, I think there should have been a bit more of a stronger focus on it. And then there are other issues that I think others may be concerned about and that have been discussed over the last 24 hours as well.
Yeah, the NPA reform didn't really feature very highly in the president's speech last night. Just a reminder for our viewers, we haven't successfully prosecuted a single senior politician who faces allegations in connection with state capture. And this is part of, when we talk about putting our economy at the center of an event like the State of the Nation address, reform of the NPA, finally giving the NPA full access to our state capture records, changing that issue with the Justice Department, that should have been at the top of or further at the top of the president's agenda, because a working justice system will ultimately feed into our economy.
Absolutely. It was important that what was highlighted is the establishment last year, the formal establishment of the Independent Directorate as a permanent body within the National Prosecuting Authority. But we know that in a couple of months' time, there are going to be debates about how the new National Director of Public Prosecutions will be chosen once again, and whether there's any formal processes that will ensure that there's transparency over it. As we know with Shamila Batoy, there was an open interview process, but that was really at the behest of the president and his own decision. And what we're really calling for is for some of those processes to be formalized so that there is a sense of public transparency over it.
The president did focus quite a bit on the issue of the water crisis in the country. I'm just looking for the page in his speech here, but he says there are serious and decisive actions being taken to resolve the water crisis, and then he lists a whole range of projects that are either in the pipeline or will be sped up. Ironically, we've just been speaking to our reporter on the ground here in Johannesburg the day after the State of the Nation address, asking people whether they watched, what they thought of the president's speech while they were filling buckets from a local tap.
Well, for us, it's critical that the fact that this is now being recognized as a nationwide crisis was there. There's an acknowledgement that there's a problem, and that's really the first step towards addressing the issue. And it's an issue that should have been addressed some time back. We've been saying that, in a number of communities, if you take Limpopo province, for example, it's not just the provision of water, but it's also the corruption within the sector, from complaints about water tanker mafias, pipelines not being laid, money being put into huge infrastructure projects, but there seemingly being no sort of delivery on it. And then you have urban areas like Johannesburg, where you have increasing water cuts with seemingly no long-term process being put in place to address some of the infrastructure issues that exist or that have developed over time. So it's critical that this must be addressed, and we'd have to see over the next period, particularly I think with the budget speech, and then implementation processes from different government departments on how government intends to address this crisis.
Yeah, unemployment will always be an issue that's high up on the president's agenda for an address like this. He's gone through all of the numbers again, gone through our shocking statistics, but he's also announced a transformation fund, he says, worth about 20 billion rand over the next 5 years, specifically to fund black-owned and small business enterprises. And then there are a whole range of other initiatives that are meant to upskill young people. It's one of the biggest crises we face, Zaakirah, the 40-odd% of our young people sitting at home without a job. It's also such an incredible lost opportunity for our country, all of that potential just sitting there. But the president hopes that our economy will grow by 3%. And if he's right, hopefully that can give us the jolt we need.
I'm not an economist, so it's difficult for me to say how some of those figures around growth development may be able to contribute to increased employment rates in the country. But you are right that unemployment is one of the most important factors impacting our democracy at the moment. It does lend itself to an overall disillusionment about democracy itself and whether our democracy is able to deliver and meet the material needs of people. We think that there is a need for innovative thinking around job creation. We have to look at newer ways in which jobs are being created in both the developing and developed world, and how we tap into these industries. I think the president spoke to some of this around technological developments, but at the basic core, I think that this needs to be given perhaps a bit more focus even within civil society on how best to contribute to these discussions around job creation, because it's certainly something that in the long term, I think begins to destabilize a democracy over time.
Yeah, and there are so many other issues, right? I'm just sort of paging through the president's speech again. It's NHI, the issues faced by pupils in schools. We're talking about pit toilets that have yet to be eradicated, HIV and AIDS. There's the national dialogue that the president announced on the Day of Reconciliation, December 16th last year. And I just see a couple of lines here from the president on the national dialogue, that it must reaffirm that each of us has a role to play in building the nation we want. When it was announced last year, the national dialogue, Zaakirah, it was announced as a real opportunity at what is a turning point in South Africa's democracy.
The national dialogue is something that we need to look out for. Critically, for Defend Our Democracy, there's really two components to this. One is determining what kind of democracy that we want. So it's interrogating the very notion of democracy. We see democracies in other parts of the world veering towards autocratic tendencies. And if you look at the USA, for example, it's a classic example of what could potentially unfold in future in our country. So one is the notion of democracy. How do we begin to champion the idea of constitutional democracy? But secondly, setting out the priorities for the country. And these relate to the practical elements that need to be addressed. So if we can all agree that unemployment is the number one factor, for example, that needs to be addressed in turning around the economy, how do we all contribute to that? From a civil society perspective, I think it's important to integrate voices of different sectors of society. And even within civil society itself, there's such a variety of views to bring that richness into the conversation. So we are now eagerly awaiting for the presidency and for government to advise how to get involved, how we can begin contributing, not just to the discussion that may take place later in the year, but to the actual thinking around the agenda that gets put on the table from the offset.
Yeah, and how we engage, for example, with our local governments. Zaakirah Vadi, let me thank you for your time this afternoon. Zaakirah is Director at Defend Our Democracy as we continue to track some reaction to the President's State of the Nation address.